Okay. Uh, let's see, more standard version number system instead of the Greek version you're currently using. Oh, well, yeah. I that was sort of an extension. I had the alpha release, and then I had the beta release, and then I just thought, okay, gamma release. Um, Actually, the thinking there, yes, it is definitely an eccentric choice. I love being eccentric. And I don't know if unfortunately people will look at it and say, well, when we get the next version will be Eta 0, and people will say, Eta what? Or even they'll look at it and say, what's that sloppy in? And and they also have no idea where Eta is in the Greek alphabet. And so, it would be nicer to call it, version 23.1.6. But anyway, let's see. So let me get going here. Well, wait. Let me just ask you guys. Let's see if show of hands, just or please indicate, do you really think I've gone too far out into the wild blue yonder with the Greek numbering system? Do you think I should revert to the conventional approach?
I think it's quite honest.
Okay.
Either way works, I think. Like, I think it depends on how many versions you have. If you end up on like the 12th version or the 12th release, then it'd make more sense to do normal numbers, I think.
Yeah, definitely when I start getting up into sigma and tau, people are gonna start
Well, once you get to Omega, I think then we're in trouble.
then I'm in trouble. I basically, I suppose I just have to die when I reach the end of Omega, so yeah, conventional would most likely be easier. So I don't know. Okay, so I have spent the last few weeks stepping back from Le Morte d'Arthur. I've been fixing some trivial bugs, but I've been trying to think about it at a more abstract level. I've been going over the usage records, doing all sorts of data analysis, uh, just thinking about it at a large level. And I started pulling together some ideas. And just a few days ago, the pieces all kind of fell together for me. And I realized I had some big realizations that I will try. I still haven't figured it all out. There's still a lot of gaps in my thinking about this, but I'd like to present what I have figured out so far. Here you go. And I'm going to do this by share screen, and we'll just do the desktop, which is share that. And let's just start here. The starting point for this discussion, in order to make things clearer, is the Crawford definition of interaction, which is I define interaction to be a cyclic process in which the human and the computer alternately listen, think, and speak. And so it starts with step one. The human listens to whatever the computer is speaking to him. It looks at the screen and figures out what it means. Step two, the human thinks about it and develops a reaction. Oh dear, I should probably change you fucking idiot to my dearest colleague. I can't seem to get, I'm trying to get somebody. No, this is really stupid. There. somebody wanted in and I had to admit them and it wouldn't allow me to do so. Stupid software, shoot the programmer. Okay, so the human thinks about it, develops a reaction to it, and then expresses that reaction back to the computer, types to my dearest colleague. And then the tables are turned. Now the computer listens to what the human has said to it. The computer thinks about it using algorithms, develops a reaction, and speaks that reaction back to the human, changing the text on the screen, whatever. So that's the basic process of interaction. And there are two aspects of this that we can understand interactive storytelling better by breaking this interaction process down into two basic components. First, the speaking, listening component, and second, the thinking component. So let's begin by considering or analyzing the speaking, listening component. There are two fundamental methodologies available for doing this, for allowing the human to express himself to the computer. The standard method used for that is language. That is, it's a story. We're going to do some storytelling here. Stories are done using language. And so parsers are far and away the most common way of doing this. They've been in use for decades. And then the alternative is the inverse parser. Let's see. Gee, it's not telling me that I'm recording, but I assume I am.
I got a message earlier saying that you were recording.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it is recording. Okay. So language is the first way, but there is another way, the choice-based methodology, where you just give the player some choices and it's radio buttons and he selects one of them. By the way, I've never been comfortable with that phrase choice-based because it's not really very descriptive. So I prefer, whoop, you stupid. There, I much prefer the explicit options, but that's 5 syllables as opposed to 2, so I can understand choice-based. Maybe we should call it cha-based, something like that, even 1 syllable.
Direct options, maybe.
Pardon?
Direct options. Would that sound good?
Direct option. I could probably come up with something using a combination of Greek and Latin roots to.
Fair.
Yeah, I could call it, alpha, or I'm sorry, pi-based choices, whatever.
There's
okay.
also the term hypertext.
Yeah, hypertext, that has a clear meaning of just a fixed branching system. So, and that you can do hypertext stories. Basically, those are the same as choose your own adventures. So, or choose your own adventures, we could say, is the very first example of a hypertext system. So anyway,
main difference is that choice-based, all of the options are defined ahead of time, and with the parser, inverse parser, the user has a lot more flexibility what they want to do at any given point.
Yep. The language-based systems are generalized. They are abstracted, whereas that's why I like the word explicit, because there is a clear differentiation between abstract and explicit. And so, but yes, in language-based systems, you have fairly abstract verbs that can be applied in a wide range of situations. whereas in the explicit system, the option given to the player is very narrow, explicit, precise. This is exactly what you're doing. And that gives more color to the interaction. I'll get into some of those issues a little later. Now, our next problem is that language does not work. It is, no matter how we've been playing around with language for decades. Now, the problem with the parser is the classic parser puzzle problem. You're never really sure what you can say to the parser or what it can understand. I mean, there were a lot of spectacular examples of this in the 80s where I'd read complaints on the bulletin board systems of people saying things like, it told, in fact, this is a real example. In this particular adventure, the guy said, the thing told him, there is a rock on the ground. And the guy had said, take rock. And he would say, I don't see any rocks. And then he would keep trying, take rock, take rock, take rock. And computers can be even more stubborn than people. And turned out the solution was to take stone, which is yes, classic example of the parser puzzle problem. And sometimes parser puzzles were built, the actual puzzle intended to be a parser puzzle problem. I think the best one was in a game that Brian Moriarty did. I think he was the one who did this, where in order to open a door or accomplish something, you had to squeeze or crush a salamander or a newt or something like that. There was this small animal that you could pick up, and you had to crush him in your hand, and that solved the problem. Nobody would have thought that you could just say, kill or crush salamander. What's bad though about this is that we now have what I call the cognoscenti community, the people who know the system. They know the parsers. They know what words are recognized by the parsers. And for them, there are no parser puzzles. It's clearly just a matter when you just type in, the language. This is a very bad development because it makes the community resistant to change. In other words, if somebody came up with a dramatic improvement on parsers, the community, consisting the community would reject it because it makes them beginners again, and they have to throw away all their hard-earned knowledge of parsers. And so the interactive fiction community has settled into something of a rut. There's all sorts of creativity being applied, but it's very difficult to break out of that rut. So that's the problem with parsers. Now, inverse parsers, I have been really the only person really pushing that hard. I have seen a few other people poke around with the idea. First, I'd like to point out, I did not invent inverse parsers. I developed them independently. I came on the idea all by myself from user interface considerations. But it turned out a few years after I built my first one for the original C-boot, I found out that Texas Instruments had patented the basic concept back in 1977. And they were doing it with menus, but it was still fundamentally an inverse parser. Now, I took the idea much, much further and developed it into Dicto, which is an extremely powerful inverse parser system, but it has its own flaws. Now, the greatest strength of Dicto is that it permits complex expressions. For example, this is old, this is about 20 years old, but here is an example of a complex expression in an inverse parser. This is a deal, and
Yeah.
explain what this is saying. Mr. Mad Scientist proposes a deal to the evil queen, in which deal Mad Scientist will reveal the number of, or how many of these magic blue things that Mona Lisa owns or possesses. And in return, evil queen will reveal to Mad Scientist how many of these green magic things that Donald Duck has. So that's the deal system. In fact, what I had for the second generation C-boot allowed even more complex deals. And trying to do this in a parser is theoretically possible, but would be impossible for a human to memorize the parser structure, because parsers require words in particular places in the sequence, and remembering the exact sequencing of all these words is just too difficult for most people. There's a clear analogy here, which is the command line user interface, such as was used in DOS and Linux, versus the graphical user interface. And what we see with those is that command line interfaces are actually more efficient for systems with maybe less than 24 verbs, because you can easily remember the grammar for that small number of verbs. But when they start growing, for example, when you start putting grep into Linux, it gets really hairy, and it's not really practical. Graphical user interfaces take you up to about 100 verbs. They can handle 100 verbs very easily, but above that, they start getting clumsy. And nowadays, quite a few applications will have several hundred verbs, which is what makes them so difficult to use. Anyway, an inverse parser is to a regular parser as a graphical user interface is to a command line interface. Anyway, so language doesn't work. It does have these complex expressions, but it's really hard to build a big vocabulary. That is my experience with building a number of story worlds using the Dicto system. 50 verbs is easy to do. It's not hard at all to pile up 50 verbs. Then it starts getting to be more work because the interactions between verbs get more complicated. You get these network effects. And I think 80 verbs or a little more than that is the maximum I've ever reached. I see 100 verbs as sort of the ceiling on what can readily be built. Now, I would think, though, that perhaps with the development of better development environments, we could extend that somewhat. But I don't think we're going to be able to get an inverse parser with 1,000 verbs in it. And then the second real killer problem with the inverse parser is that it has a very mechanical feel to it. It's very colorless. You're just clicking on icons, and it's very repetitive in style. It just doesn't work.
Say Dicto, are you excluding purely text-based where every option is a word like you used in Storytron?
Yes, that does help, especially when you use something like the Tinker Toy text system that I developed that allows substitution of words, synonyms, alternate phrasings, and so forth.
I like that.
Yeah, that was very nice. Problem is that took a lot of time too. And so, yeah, if you had a big budget and lots of writers working on it, you probably could ameliorate that problem with Tinker Toy text. But again, it raises the cost. Now, maybe I shouldn't consider this to be a significant problem because, after all, nowadays they spend tens of millions of dollars building A-level games. But
Could I add something?
yeah,
I know you say it's very mechanical. I know you say this stuff is very mechanical, but I don't really see anything else using something like this. Like, I've played C-Boot, and yeah, it does feel a little bit mechanical, but I feel like it's something I'd like to try making myself. Yeah, I know it's mechanical, but I think that when you understand the system, you can sort of understand the drama, I guess, what's going on.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think Emily Short did something similar with Blood and Laurels. That, I mean, it had the same sort of mechanical feeling, but I think that was just because it was sort of unfinished. Like, there weren't a lot of synonyms and variations on sentences, but it felt really similar to Storytron playing it.
Yeah. I gotta make a change here. This the interaction between the Keynote software and the Zoom software makes it impossible for me to follow the chat or oh God, yeah, you people have been typing in a lot of stuff and I haven't seen any of it. Let me quickly review. Okay, good. Okay, good, yes.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think there's always going to be like this inductive hesitancy in a lot of users as far as typing things in, and I think that more than the power of the AI to handle text in a smooth way or other mechanical things that have emerged in interactive fiction. I don't think that's the point. I think it's that there's a difference between like kind of steering between different paths, maybe the path of least resistance, maybe one that's got a little more resistance, and like inductively verbalizing. I think it uses a part of the brain that's different, essentially, than somebody being immersed in the momentum of a dramatic sequence of events and kind of, role playing it in a more of a flow. And I think that's the real strength. And also, I think that choices at some point we might be able to merge language parsing with choices in a way. But like if you were to inverse parse a bajillion verbs effectively, what is the underlying simulation that handles all of that possibility in any given situation or encounter, right? So we have to like I've been working with Sweep Weave. There's a lot of copy pasting you're going to want to do, and this kind of nesting dynamic is a part of like branching narrative exponential death wall of work that people can bang their heads against. So you can ameliorate that. I think AIs would be great at pre-drafting lots of this JSON forming, so I don't have to spend a lot of that time. But yeah, what's the gameplay, right? Like, and how's it paced? I think that's kind of the bottom line.
One other problem with this.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. One other problem with this, though, is that you have to have the players on the same page as the software itself. So if the player decides, I found myself doing this a lot with a lot of text adventures. It's like I didn't necessarily know what I was supposed to do in any situation. So I'm, kind of poking around, looking around, all this other kind of stuff, and missing some of the obvious things that the game designer intended me to do. And part of this is also with like role-playing games where people will, the adage is, never underestimate your players, because they will literally do the thing that you don't want them to do. And they will focus on that thing that you.
Yeah.
And so you have to also have it so that the computer some way just either guides them back in or says, you know what, let's have another adventure. with this thing that you're going to fixate on until you get it out of your system, and then we can go and play the rest of the game.
I should note that Wizards of the Coast actually went like full, they like doubled down on this, and they're trying to charge $30 a month, which isn't going to work. They're going to have to unbundle it, maybe lower the price point. And there's a lot of kickback from that audience, because a lot of the reason why people like tabletop games is the social aspect. So this business of selling you a physical book that you're kind of overpaying for, so you have the luxury of like the nice dice and all this. I think that's like too niche, and they see that and they want big numbers. They want to get these billion-dollar revenues like FIFA gets on microtransactions every year and stuff like that, right? And pump Hasbro stock. And I respect that as a capitalist. But then, you know, it's easy to miss, right? So the initial feedback isn't great, but they are going in that kind of direction. And I think they could experiment with like tools for DMs, async stuff. So it's like Words with Friends, but it's like D&D with friends, kind of a, you know, and you can play casually, like stuff like that. They might be able to make money on, but not the original sauce, right? And I think that tabletop games are a great reference for interactive storytelling, but in a way they represent one polarity that is maybe not attainable, or by the time it's attainable, it's already the technological singularity, and we have like bigger fish to fry. So,
I need to push on here because it's 8:30 already, and I'm only, I think, about a third of the way through. Just a quick response to Craig. On the note your phrasing, trying to figure out what the designer intends for you to do. That right there, that's death. The player should be the one exercising free will. So, okay, now let's move on to the second dimension here of the player speaking, and that's the explicit options thing. Now, one of the nice things about it is that you can have as few or as many as you wish. Le Morte d'Arthur has a maximum of 3, and I never once felt the need to have more than 3. Indeed, the real problem is coming up with more than one good alternative. So that's actually, though, a strength. Another big strength of explicit options is that they can be very expressive. You can make them as long as you want and put in all sorts of colorful language and so forth. So that's the big advantage over parsers or inverse parsers. And finally, you can directly tie an algorithm to a particular option. It's very easy to simply say, all right, if he chooses this, here's your little algorithm right here. So explicit options have a goodly number of advantages. So reviewing this, when we look at the two, the choice-based system does look to be superior. If you had to choose between them. But now let's go to the other big dimension of considering the problem, and that's the matter of how the computer developed, what kinds of algorithms the computer uses. And one way to express this is through the two architectures of trees or ramps. I'll explain ramps in a minute, but first let's talk about trees. Now, trees actually arose from the basic structure of a story, which is a sequence of events that have some logically dramatic significance to them. And really, if you want to add interaction to that, then you have to have choice. And so you allow branching at each leaf of the tree. And this is the minimum pure tree structure. Basically, the minimum number of choices you need to give people options is 2. So, I mean, you could have 3 or 4 or 5, but this is the absolute minimum you need for a purely interactive system. And the problem with this, it's funny, is that you get the exponential explosion. That is, on turn 1, the player has 2 choices, and then The next turn, there are 4 choices, and then 8 and 16 and 32 and so forth. And the number of leaves you must generate is equal to 2 raised to the power of the number of turns you intend to provide. In other words, you can, if you want to have a story that's just 10 turns long, you're going to need 1,000 leaves. This is the exponential explosion. It's funny, I first pointed this out in a lecture at GDC, God, late 80s, maybe 1990 at the latest. And I've put this in articles I've written and in my books. And for some reason, the community, everybody has to learn this for themselves the hard way. If for some reason, the community has failed to really, tell the beginner, don't try to build a big tree because it'll explode on you. So everybody learns the hard way. And so this is the killer problem with trees, and there are a variety of solutions that have been developed. The first is fold back. You give the player a choice, but whatever choice he makes, you just fold back to whatever you intend. This is fraudulent interactivity. Sure, you can make any choice you want, but it won't affect anything. So this is a common problem with, well, a lot of people do this and they still don't seem to have learned that it doesn't work very well. It's fraudulent.
A lot of games tend to do this.
Pardon?
A lot of games tend to do this.
Oh, yeah. Yep. So let me see.
Horrible.
Yep. Oh, the next solution is
the wonderful one. The wonderful one.
Yeah. This is very common in games. You can look up the word thaumatrope. I'm not going to. Well, no, wait.
It's like the. I think it's like the one with the bird in the cage.
Yeah. All right. Oh, here's my phone. In fact, this describes the what's illustrated there. So let me get this right. There you go. So
Fight monsters.
You do a game.
Fight monsters.
And then you flip to a story.
Watch cutscenes.
Yeah.
Fight monsters. Watch
cutscenes. When you do it fast enough, it's a story game. Ta-da! This is a thaumatrope. And this dominates games. And it's a stupid thing. The belief of the designer is that by combining a dramatic but non-interactive story with an undramatic but interactive game, you end up with the interactivity and the drama. In fact, what you end up with is neither. The drama is watered down to nothing because of all the interruptions, and the interaction is watered down by all the cutscenes. So
yeah,
it's a lose-lose proposition.
The JRPG classic structure.
Let's see. This is another one. In this one, you get lots and lots of options, but there's only one that works. If you take any of the other options, you die. This was best demonstrated in the classic Laserdisc game in 82 or 83, I think, called Dragon's Lair, which was a big sensation at first, but then people realized just how stupid it was. So this is fraudulent interactivity too. Yeah, you have choices, but only one lets you live. This is another approach, cycle back. That is, you give them a choice, and if they don't like the choice, well, then you just jump back to a previous turn. This gets boring real fast. But now let me show you the one that does work, and that's oh, come on, Chris.
Directed graph.
Let me oh, I know the problem. Okay. Oh well. too bad. Thing didn't, I know what I can do. If I go to play, there, directed graph, yes. And the directed graph allows you to take a zillions and zillions of different pathways through the graph. And the problem, and in order to make it work, you have to have a set of global variables that change as you move through the web or the net. And the trick, of course, is that this is Pac-Man. And the global variables are the pill or the food things, the ghosts, and the power pills. So this is all very, I mean, this really works. At least it worked great with Pac-Man. And this was the fundamental approach I took with my Storytron technology. But again, it was just too complicated to make it work. And so in the end, I had to give up on it. So let me, oh, well, now I can actually, no, I'm not gonna. Let me catch up on the text here. Well, I'm just gonna keep, I'm going to keep moving here. I'd now like to throw in a quick rant that I call anti-Booleanism. Everyone doing trees traverses the trees with Boolean expressions. And I condemn this vociferously. The right way to do it is with numeric expressions. Now, I am kind of joking in the lower left of the illustration. You really don't need to use exponentials and hyperbolic tangents and so forth. In fact, I'll show you an example. Basically, I want to point out the only reason people use Boolean expressions is because they're too stupid to use arithmetic. They are lazy and unwilling to go to the extra effort of using a numeric expression, and I condemn this behavior as just missing out on enormous potential. Boolean is, you know, 1 bit, and you really can't do a lot with 1 bit.
Yeah.
Tell us what you really think, Chris.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, you don't need to go to the full 64-bit, you know, floating point, whatever. It turns out Lemort d'Arthur operates on something like 8 bits, fundamentally. I mean, it's using floating points, but the resolution is that of about 8 bits. This is what happens when you're brought up on the 6502 and you just can't break out of that 8-bit thinking. But I didn't plan it that way. Anyway, so please use numeric values. Here, for example, is the algorithm used for Lemort d'Arthur. And you can see it involves 1 multiplication and 1 addition, and that's all.
BG plus T times TD plus AS.
Yep, that's it.
What do these stand for? What do these stand for? I wonder.
Let's see. BG is bad good. TD is
Oh yeah, timid dominant.
AS is asabiya. So anyway, the very simple algorithm. And
Also, it uses just like 3 variables. Sorry to interrupt. It uses just like these 3 variables. It doesn't use like other characters, bad, good, timid, dominant, whatever. Just uses 1, I guess.
yeah, basically it's the 1 towards Arthur. That's all that matters.
Yeah. Okay.
There's another variable used in there, but I won't get into that. It shows up elsewhere. So see, you don't have to get that complicated. Through my career, I have used almost entirely linear equations with just multiplication, addition. I'd say I've used a square root maybe 1% of the time. And very rarely, a 0.1% of the time, I've used something a little more sophisticated. But multiplication and addition will get you 99% of the way there. So you don't need to be that hairy. Okay, now let me talk about ramp structures as opposed to tree structures. Ramp is my term for the architecture I used in Le Morte d'Arthur. And this is a simplified schematic version of that architecture. Basically, it's a linear story with 3 endings. Now, that sounds, by the way, has everyone seen the little video I did on YouTube a week
Yeah.
ago? That
Yeah.
talks about this too. So
Yeah.
at any given leaf, your 3 options go to the same leaf, but they change the global variables differently. And that is what makes the whole system work. Here's a good way of thinking about it. Here are 2 global variables, and this is how they change over the course of the story, based on the player's choices. And theoretically, all of these values will start off at 0 at the beginning, and then they will climb to something else or maybe fall. But that's why I call it a ramp. You expect the values to, generally speaking, increase over the course of the story. And then you just decide how their values produce the choice at the ending. So this is what I call the ramp architecture. Although, again, I do not claim to have invented this. Fragments of this idea in various forms have appeared as early as the 1980s. I don't know if anybody has formalized it like this and made it central to the design. I don't think so. But some of you may know one that has done so.
I mean, James kind of advocates this about like not having any real branching until the very end based on global variables.
Who?
The Choice of Games.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. So Choice of Games really does use global. Oh, very interesting. Very interesting.
Games the last few years.
So here's the algorithm at the end, or an example of what the algorithm might look like. If your final calculation is greater than this, you do the top. If it's less than that, you do the bottom. And if it falls in the middle, you do the middle. And that's it. Very simple stuff here. The value of doing it this way, as opposed to doing it Boolean, is that numeric values permit character development. This is a fundamental problem with trees and Boolean values. For example, if you talk about a romance story, how much the girl loves the guy does not proceed in Boolean fashion, as in,
No.
oh, I don't care. Oh God, I love him so much. Just because he bought her an ice cream cone or something. Boolean expressions simply do not permit character development, or any of the types of slow developments that are really fundamental to stories. If stories were fundamentally Boolean in nature, they would be just 2 items long. Once upon a time, there was a young boy who lacked courage, but then he got in a fight, and afterwards he was courageous. That's a Boolean story. We can do a lot better than that. The development of love is better characterized by a curve looking like this: some ups, some downs. Anyway, let's see what else. So Le Morte d'Arthur, let me just have a quick look at this here. Oh yeah, Le Morte d'Arthur is an example of what you can do with a ramp-based system. But there are other things that can be well done with a ramp. For example, let's go over here. The hero's journey, Joseph
Yeah.
Campbell, basis for Star Wars. The hero's journey is basically an incremental process by which the protagonist goes through a series of experiences that slowly mature him. Basically, it's sort of how a boy becomes a man. And so to do a hero's journey, a very simple version, you would simply have a variable called manhood. And it starts off at 0 at the beginning. And the protagonist goes through all sorts of experiences. And if the player is doing things well, then at the end, it's congratulations, you're a man now. You can marry the princess or whatever. Another thing that does very well in a ramp-based system is a romance story. Boy meets girl, and they go through all of the pluses and minuses, and slowly their affection for each other ramps up. And so if the player is doing things well, then the player, they fall in love, get married, live happily ever after until they have kids, and then they sell. But there are some catches to ramp-based systems. Basically, this is one that few people really recognize, and that is that the events, the leaves, the encounters in a ramp-based system must be sequential, but not consequential.
Yeah.
That is, they can't be linked as logical consequences. You cannot have a conversation in a ramp-based system, because you come to it. Let's talk about the romance. Boy meets girl. They're at a social event. Boy meets girl. Boy says, "Hi there, my name is Martin. What is your name?" And yes, she can respond by saying, "Oh, my name is Marianne." But then what? If you want to give them options, you've got a tree. You're not adjusting global variables at this point. So really, this is one of the biggest problems with ramp-based systems. It requires a very different style of writing. Anecdotal might be a way to explain it. Now, I have always used this style of writing. Well, not always, but I mean, I developed this style way back with C-Boot. And the very first one, with the encounter system in C-Boot. Honey, why shouldn't it be allowed? It's dependent on Luke's choice, should be a valid one. Well, yeah, if you want to do a conversation, you need a tree. And in fact, that's what I do in Le Morte d'Arthur. I do have trees in Le Morte d'Arthur. And in fact, I mix a number of things. In Le Morte d'Arthur, I have explicit options, I have dialogue trees, and I have a ramp system. So it is really a mixture of these. And here we come to the core of the big epiphany I had, and that is that there is no one system that can work. Indeed, I knew this 35 years ago when I did the very first C-Boot. I had an inverse parser and I had an encounter system with explicit options. And you didn't alternate between them, but you could flip back, or the system would flip back and forth between them at random points. And it worked. And I forgot about that. When I started doing the second C-Boot, I concentrated exclusively on the inverse parser. Talk about a blunder. If I'd started from day one with the realization that I needed both of these, See, the inverse parser allows you to do complicated things. In an explicit option system, you can't do a deal. Imagine explicit options where you say, I propose a deal to Mary in which I will tell this information about so-and-so if she will tell this information about so-and-so. Or I will make a deal with Mary in which I tell her this and this and this, and she tells me that and that and that. The number of combinations are enormous. And you can't do that with explicit options. That's why you need the inverse parser. However, the inverse parser has this cold mechanical feel. If you look at it, it's just it's mechanical. And so the two together, each one compensates for the other's weaknesses. The system worked really well. And I forgot about that. And so really, here's the final conclusion. I think the best way to build a story world is to combine all of the above: explicit options, dialogue trees, a ramp architecture, an inverse parser, and a directed graph. You put all of them together, and I think you can build a really good story world. So that's the conclusion. Chris at 8:53 says a ramp is defined as having no branch until the end game. You can do localized trees. That is, you're going down the line and you have a little localized tree, but when you're done with that tree, you go back to the main storyline. And so you can have sort of internal trees. You might call them scenes.
I know you can mix or cycle between these different structures. I was just saying that the ramp portion itself is defined as being a linear sequence.
Yes, yes. So really what we're talking about is a hybridization of these different structures. And it's messy, but I believe this can be made to work. If I were 5 years younger, I would go back and restart C-Boot with an encounter system built into it. C-Boot did have dialogue trees and the inverse parser and the directed graph, but it didn't have the explicit options in the ramp. So anyway, that's and I've come to the end, so let's catch up on some of the. You called your wife Mortimer Snurd?
No, I gave her the name Mortimer Snurd.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because I'm a weird person. But yes.
Yeah. Where did that character appear? It was some
Charlie McCarthy's ventriloquist dummy was Mortimer Snurd. One of them. Yes.
I have a conceptual thing I'd like to add that's been really helpful for the work I've been doing. So I've done two what I like to call scenario designs. I saw that in Japanese video games back in the 90s. There's some guy's the scenario designer, right? So he's the guy who's kind of the meta. It's like the lead level designer, I guess. But in storytelling, it really is about a scenario where there are many different, not only outcomes, but ways that things can develop, right? So you figure that out, you end up with some kind of a big tree, but sheared, prune with heuristics and foldbacks and the ramping dynamics, and we're mixing those together. But I think to add to this, the idea that the DAG gives you, which is there's this fate that is inevitably creeping upon you. And it reminds me a lot of general relativity. So if you have a black hole, you're in a space where the future is inevitably the center of the black hole. But a lot of things can happen in that space where your angular momentum and how long it takes you to fall in and how many orbits you do around it, can vary. Now you're still going to end up in the black hole's center anyway, right? But the angle that you hit it at in a real black hole probably doesn't matter to anybody or anything because it has no causal connection to the universe. But in a moral analogy, it could make a lot of difference, right? And I do think that that's a part of it too, is like the moral thing, not necessarily in any specific philosophical or religious rubric, but in some rubric, right? Or possibly a clash of rubrics, which is kind of fun. So I've got one design, which I've told you guys about, where instead of it being this big sci-fi setting, it's focused on one solar system, on one escalating series of events that everything's coming to a head, and it's kind of apocalyptic, and you're like drawn into that. And how can you like rise above that and make the best of it is quite hard, because reacting violently is easy. And then the other design that I've done is a Planescape sequel that I want to pitch and maybe commercialize this kind of thing. And I really like the story I've come up with. But here I'm going with, instead of two perspectives, a protagonist and a geotagonist who's more in touch with his id, the protagonist is more conflicted. Here you determine your morality in the early part of the game, die, and go to the afterlife for that morality, and that determines your path through the cosmos and how you might, and then you can switch midway. So I'm making a more ambitious diagram there. So I'd love to present on this stuff next month when I'm ready, and I got something to show for that.
I'd like to respond to let's see. Here we go. Hanil asked, so do you have to have all your endings defined before you start your story world? Well, certainly it's before you start working on something, there should be a long creative phase where you're just imagining all the different parts and how they're all going to fit together. It's just like writing a program. You really need to think through input structures, data structures, outputs. So you need to get the whole picture before you start writing any code. So I would think that, yeah, you need to define your endings. Oh yes, and Chris, you can actually work backwards if you really want to. If you're impatient, it's probably better to start with the endings and work backwards. But anyway,
I like to be surprised by other endings that come up from thinking, well, maybe that could, in this context, it could twist. The thing is, it's gotten so cheap to make content to accompany this, and we're relying on text, but now you can do it visually. So it's not like in traditional games where they have a lot of budget and time lag on content, and so everything is oriented around the one ramp spine, because that's all you can afford to do. But now you can afford to do whatever you want. It's kind of great.
Abdinor has a point about whether the inverse parser deteriorates the quality. I would say that the inverse parser provides something that the explicit options, the ramp system, doesn't provide, and that is detailed interaction. Again, the best example is the deal structure, whereas the ramp structure permits color. You can really get into describing the characters, having very fine gradations of choices, whereas the choices in the inverse parser tend to be rather chunky. So in general, I say the two complement each other. Let's see. Sasha, you wanted to say something?
So it sounds like you're connecting the ramp structure in how the computer is thinking about things to the choice structure and how the computer is listening, and the inverse parser and how the computer is listening to the node-based structure in how the computer is thinking. Is that correct?
Yeah. Really, I would guess, I don't have experience with this, but I would guess that the inverse parser would be used for dealing with the more mechanical aspects. If you want to have a trading system, merchandise, that kind of thing. Or if you want to get into spatial stuff, which I recommend against, but if you want to be able to say, I want to go to Fred's house so I can talk to Fred, then yes, you could. That would be a good use of a inverse parser. So I think this is
But
just an area we're going to have to explore.
but let's say we add such a system to Lamort-Dartor. What value does it add? Like the point of Lamort-Dartor is the big lesson that it teaches.
Yeah.
What value does the mechanical stuff that we add adds to the purpose of the story world?
I would not add an inverse parser to Lamort-Dartor, but that's largely because Lamort-Dartor is a finished design. If I were starting all over, would I have? I don't know. There might be some value for the inverse parser in the battle sequences, because that would give the player many more degrees of freedom during battle. But the heart of Lamort-Dartor are the dialogues with Merlin. And those are clearly dialogues. They are tree structures, but they're best done with a choice-based system. So that's a good question, though.
So would you say it's to add more interactivity? Because players tend, I guess, complain that they don't have much to do while they're before the end. Is that what it adds?
I would use the inverse parser in a story world where there is a goodly amount of material interaction. That is, when it's strictly emotional interaction, or maybe I should say cognitive interaction. If you're just talking about ideas or emotions, I don't think an inverse parser is very good for that. Although I did something vaguely like that with the gossip design, but that was awfully formalized. I'm not sure. Again, I feel it's probably an area that needs to be explored.
Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri has a dialogue system where you can have conversations with the characters and you can trade with them because they're leaders of other factions. And it uses a choice-based structure. It's similar to an inverse parser, except that instead of creating the whole deal on one screen, you go through a series of choices. So you say, hey, I want to trade something with you. And they say, well, what would you like to trade? And you say, well, I'd like this from you. And they say, what are you offering in return? And I say, I'm offering this in return. So it's using the choice-based structure to do that kind of material interaction. And it seemed to work pretty well. I really like that game. I'm a bit biased, but
so this is the rather like the point somebody made that with a good spreadsheet you can basically implement anything that general purpose programming language could implement. In fact, there's now a formalized definition of how a computational structure can be defined as being all powerful or something like that.
I have seen those spreadsheet systems in the wild. I mean, literally, there was one person that was doing what I would consider the most remarkable and most horrifying thing I have ever seen spreadsheets do. And it was an absolute marvel, but in the same way that I was looking at the face of God and melting.
Yeah. So let's see. Eliminate weakness. I wouldn't know how to design an inverse parser in such a way that it doesn't feel mechanical. because it is intrinsically mechanical. You're clicking on things. Now, yes, if you use a text and a Tinker Toy text with a menu structure, it wouldn't feel as mechanical, but it could get very complicated if you wanted to have adverbs that provide fine nuance to a verb that you're applying. For example, I kiss so and so, and is this a just friendly kiss, a peck on the cheek, sexually hot, passionate kiss, a kiss on the forehead? There's so many variations there. You could get into all sorts of lengthy efforts there. So
I thought of an interface here where we use icons that maybe emblematize this. So are you violently rebuking somebody with your words? Mouth icon, whatever. And you can color code them. And then you could even possibly, hovering over them, maybe you get the tooltip text. So it lets you know formally what we're using now as the names, the text names of the options. And then you could possibly also add this adverbial, maybe you can click and drag, and you can like really wind up that kiss or that rebuke. You can give them a long rebuke, so it's going to affect how mad they are, how persuaded, and things like that. Or maybe you overdo it and it's obsequious and the sweet spot's in the middle, right? Or you know what I mean? Some people really like an understated guy, and they respond to that.
yeah,
It sounds like the original Sabut, what you're talking about.
That's funny. We're going back in time. We're all coming full circle. Yeah.
okay.
But in this milieu, though, because Sabut was sort of like Danny Bunton's game, but with the proto-Crawfordian drama elements, right? So we're like kind of taking the Danny Bunton game out of this and making our own simulations underneath. But
I consider the original C-Boot to be the most creative thing I've ever done, because basically I hit all the right buttons with it. Now, it was still very primitive based on what was possible with the technology at the time, but it was a very good design. And as story worlds go, it was way ahead of its time. So yeah, I really should have done that second generation C-Boot. Let's see.
So on this topic, I wanted to speak with Sasha because he hasn't responded to my emails. So maybe I'll re-up on Patreon and hit you up there.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I guess you're really busy. You're not working on this full time, right? So that's fine.
Right.
You are working on it full time.
No, I'm working on it part time.
Yeah.
I actually have a day job where I work a significant amount of overtime. So
of course. Hey, and I got a baby, and I mean, absolutely. But but the passion makes us budget the time, right? But let's figure out. I've got a Bulgarian guy who could help, and let's make the HTML export with some kind of. We could try this Wagnerian approach, or we could do something that's more like Lemort d'Artour with somewhat different proportions or whatever.
So I've had multiple people ask or express an interest in images being used in Sweepweave. Sweepweave does have HTML support. You can use HTML tags within your encounters. So it may already be possible to add images. I haven't really used that in my own games so far, but that's something. I'm not sure how much work would be involved in making a better interface for it beyond just HTML tags. I would like to have a kind of Tinker Toy text system in Sweepweave. And if you have that kind of thing, if you have a more advanced text editing feature, then you could have image support, because similarly to how you're currently using the scripting system to make acceptability scripts and desirability scripts, you could use the scripting system. This is a suggestion Chris Conley made some time ago. you could use the scripting system to make a piece of text where it concatenates different things together. And then one of the operators could just be insert this image at this point into the text.
Yes.
So-
Sasha, I want to give you a caution based on bitter experience. Do not try too hard to satisfy the requests of users.
Yeah,
Somebody needs to keep that thing under control, and it will turn into a huge, ugly mess if you implement every request made. So you need to think in terms of the whole thing being complete and concise. And there are times when you just have to say, no. My worst mistake with the Storytron technology was permitting spatial movement, allowing people to do things with spatial movement. And that just screwed things up. It didn't really help much at all. So
I want to actually add something to the difficulty of spatial stuff, which is like space. I think the spatial just gives you something else to have to work on, have to play test, and just because I tried to make a couple of games with them, like a story. It doesn't use any of your techniques. It was very difficult to justify where characters are going without justifying it in the story. It's a bit of a mess trying to put in spatial stuff.
I'd like to respond to Ajmal's two comments. The first one, the longer one, my experience with inverse parsers, and I've done a lot of inverse parser stuff with my Erasmatron and the Storytron technology. Yes, they do provide a freer, more open world. A ramp system definitely keeps the player on a tight path, whereas the inverse parser just allows all sorts of creativity. However, that also, the inverse parser system also can produce aimlessness. That is, gee, what do I do now? In general, I would caution you that yes, inverse parsers make great sandboxes, but sandboxes aren't stories. And so, this brings me to your second comment. You talk about the player creating his own stories. I see that relationship as more a matter of the designer creating an architecture for, here's a better way. The designer is God. The player is a human. God sets up the parameters under which the player must operate. Sorry, you live on planet Earth, you have to breathe, there are other people you need to eat, blah, blah, blah. All these constraints on your behavior, and now you get to go see whether you're going to be a good guy or a bad guy, and the end result of this game is just two outcomes. And you'll choose one or the other based on your behavior.
hopefully it's not the other people that you're eating. You said there are other people you need to eat.
Oh, sorry. So anyway, I would suggest that the strength of the explicit option or ramp approach is that it does allow something closer to a story to develop with the designer expressing himself artistically. A good comparison would be the Storytron C-boot, which really didn't have much artistic content in it. There was an aimlessness to it, whereas Le Morte d'Arthur is unquestionably art. it has a clear message, and it's much closer to a story. So maybe the way to think about it is sandbox versus story. Sandbox can be a fun place, but story, I think, is going to need to be based on some sort of ramp architecture. Let's see.
I like that description of a story world being aimful or aims that Patrick and Chris Conley put in the chat.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
There's a kind
well,
of forward momentum to him.
we're
I
way
want to
over
just share
time.
one more kind of breakthrough that I've had in the last month, which is this idea of pacing with soundtrack. And so I picked some theme songs that I wanted to do, you know, originally for trailers, and I slow them down to a quarter, not for much, but for like extremely downbeat, half for kind of act one ramp up, and then 3/4 for act three, like escalation into everything's gonna come to a head kind of energy, and then, you know, finally the full thing. And I figure I can probably reach out to some of these artists and make some deals, and this also makes things more marketable. But to me, it's essential to my whole artistic oeuvre, and I like the idea of you're psychologically anticipating the progression in the bars, and so by keeping pace in the timing of the bars with absorbing the context of not a lot of words and image, and then these, you know, 3 or 4 options, you can really flow through in like 25 or 40 minutes, depending on the size of the story, or maybe longer, but you know. And what we want is for people to complete these things and then replay them, because they're itching to think, oh man, that was terrible, how could I fix it? You know, I gotta fix it. What could I do differently? And if we get people thinking that way, I think we'll have a sort of the audience engineering groundwork. And I think music's an insidious way to plant seeds to acculturate those expectations by first getting people to complete the fucking game, you know, which is what we're trying to optimize, right? So
Yeah, I've done a little
yeah.
bit of work with procedurally generated music linked with interactive fiction. I'm interested in that more. Also, Patrick, I think you were the one talking about using AI to help bulk up some of these where there needs to be a ton of content. I'd like to talk with you about that.
Okay, any last comments before I close this down here? Okay, then, well, I'll see you guys next month.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Chris.
Okay,
Thank you, everyone.
bye-bye.
And this was a lot of fun, and looking forward to the
Yes.
next one. I will send you a presentation. I hope not to take up the whole slot, but you know, maybe 20 minutes.
Okay, okay,
I'm gonna put in the
bye-bye.
effort. Yeah.
Bye.